Good morning. The committee will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11, the chair announces that she may postpone calls for roll call votes. Pursuant to the notice, the committee meets to consider the following measures. H.R. 3597, Solar Energy Research and Development Act of 2019, H.R. 3607, Fossil Energy Research and Development Act 2019, H.R. 3609, Wind Energy Research and Development Act of 2019, and H.R. 335, South Florida Clean Coastal Waters Act of 2019. Welcome to today's markup of 4 bipartisan bills. The first 3 bills, H.R. 2597 and 3607, as well as 3609, all deal with various aspects of research, development, and demonstration of advanced energy technology. All of these bills directly address the growing issue of climate change by focusing the federal government's energy research efforts toward cutting greenhouse gas emissions. Our committee has held five hearings this Congress on various topics related to climate change. We've heard firsthand of the dangers of our society, from increases in extreme heat, extreme weather, droughts, rising oceans, and the many other dangers associated with climate change. These climate change impacts are not just problems in the future. Our communities are already being affected by climate change. If we don't take serious steps to address this problem, our people are going to needlessly suffer as the effects of climate gets worse. I say needlessly suffer because we have the power to address the climate change before the next worse impacts occur. Supporting the 3 energy research bills today is part of that effort. These bills support continuous investment in these critical areas of energy research: solar power, wind power, and fossil fuel power. It is abundantly clear that we will need more renewable energy connected to our grid if we are going to reduce carbon emissions in America. H.R. 3597 and H.R. 3609 provide for sustained investments in solar and wind research and development to help drive down the cost of these technologies and to help to get them into the market. I want to recognize the bill's sponsor, Mr. McAdams and Mr. Tonko, for their hard work on these bills. It is also abundantly clear that fossil energy will continue to be part of our electric grid for some time to come. Without real and sustained investments in research and development to more cleanly utilize fossil fuels, it would be extremely difficult to meaningfully cut carbon dioxide emissions from our power sector. H.R. 3607 calls for these investments, and I want to recognize my colleague from Texas, Mr. Vesey, for his efforts in moving this legislation forward. These 3 bills are endorsed by industry trade groups like the Chamber of Commerce, the Solar Industry Association, the Wind Energy Association, the Carbon Utilization Research Council. And they're also endorsed by the environmental organizations like the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Environmental Defense Fund. Finally, scientific societies like the American Chemical Society have also endorsed these bills. I hope folks can take a moment to realize how unusual it is to have these different organizations endorse the same bills. I'll ask that the full list of endorsements be placed into the record. And finally, we're considering H.R. 335, which is sponsored by Mr. Mask from Florida. This bill addresses harmful algae blooms, and I support Mr. Mask's effort to address this problem. I now recognize our ranking member for his opening statements.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for holding this markup. Today, we consider 4 pieces of legislation, 3 of which are bills the committee is, as of this moment, unable to reach a bipartisan agreement on. I'm disappointed that we haven't made more progress in reaching a bipartisan consensus, especially since this committee has one of the best track records in Congress of passing productive bipartisan legislation. Now, I want to be clear, these three bills are well-intentioned. I believe there's still a chance for bipartisanship in the future. Matter of fact, I expect it. But the fact is, our job in Congress is to set priorities and focus our limited federal funds where we can see the best return on investment. Unfortunately, the bills we'll consider today don't meet that standard. Instead, they offer aspirational funding levels that we simply cannot afford. The first bill we'll consider today is H.R. 3597, the Solar Energy Research and Development Act of 2019. This legislation authorizes solar energy research conducted by the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. EERE received almost $2.4 billion in funding in 2019 and is DOE's largest applied research program. This legislation would authorize approximately $1.5 billion for this work, reaching a 33% total increase in funding from enacted levels by 2024. And while this legislation includes authorizations for some critical research priorities that I support, like innovative energy storage, next-generation solar technologies, and advanced computer capacities, it focuses heavily on expanding the development of technology that already exists. Our second bill this morning is H.R. 3607, the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act of 2019. This bill reauthorizes DOE's energy research and development programs and brings total funding in this area to over $1 billion by FY 2024, a 36% increase from enacted levels. This bill is also singularly focused on emissions control technologies. While those technologies are certainly part of a balanced fossil energy portfolio, there's a lot more work to be done to maximize our nation's fossil fuel resources. Next, we'll consider H.R. 3609, the Wind Energy Research and Development Act of 2019. This authorizes wind energy research conducted under EERE and would provide over $570 million more for this work. This amounts to a 37% increase from levels enacted in 2024. And while I support some elements of this legislation, like basic research in material science, hybrid energy systems, its primary focus, again, is on reducing so-called market barriers for existing wind technologies. I'm thrilled at the growth I've seen in wind and solar industries in the past decade, but American industry is already leading the way in developing these technologies, and we won't discover the next game-changing technology by duplicating their efforts. Finally, the committee will consider H.R. 335, the South Florida Clean Coastal Waters Act of 2019. The legislation requires the Interagency Task Force on Harmful Algae Blooms and Hypoxia to produce an integrated assessment on the causes, consequences, and potential mitigation options to reduce HABs and hypoxia in South Florida. This legislation also calls for the task force to identify the current status and gaps in research, monitoring, and management efforts, develop an action plan for reducing, mitigating, and controlling HABs and hypoxia in the same region. I'm supportive of this legislation, and I want to thank the chairwoman for including it in today's markup. Before I close, I want to make it clear I'm supportive of DOE funding for innovative research that will lead to new solar, wind, and fossil energy technologies. But as stewards of the taxpayers' resources, we must focus funding on projects that are truly cutting edge, those that can't be undertaken by private industry, like basic research in advanced computing, advanced manufacturing, and the development of new materials. Our national debt's $22 billion and rising. We simply can't afford to increase spending in every program, and we'll have to make choices about where we invest. I'd like to take this opportunity to extend an invitation to my good friends across the aisle. There's so much we can agree on. I hope in the future we can take the common sense approach, work together to invest in basic research we all support. And I would offer one final observation to my friends on both sides of the dais. Having been a ranking member and a chairman before on another standing committee, I always reminded all of my friends that the majority has the right and the responsibility to govern, but by the same token, the minority has the right and the responsibility to be heard. And today, we're going to offer suggestions on how to improve these bills. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We now will consider H.R. 3597, the Solar Energy Research and Development Act of 2019. The clerk will report the bill.
Committee print of H.R. 3597, a bill.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize Mr. McAdams on this bill.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas, for the opportunity to speak on my bill, H.R. 3597, the Solar Energy Research and Development Act. I'd like to also thank Mr. Fortenberry of Nebraska for his leadership on this legislation. It's been a pleasure to work with him. This legislation would authorize the Department of Energy to pursue solar energy research, development, demonstration, and demonstration on a range of solar energy technologies, including photovoltaic and concentrating solar panel systems. This legislation enables the Department of Energy the ability to expand capacity and efficiency within the solar energy sector while also pushing for new, innovative ways solar panels and solar power can be integrated into our existing infrastructure. H.R. 3597 focuses on the near-term, the mid-term, and the long-term targets, ensuring our commitment to America's leadership in the global energy economy and ensuring sustainable energy for the next generation of Americans. It also aids with developing solar as a reliable source of energy, lessening our dependence on foreign markets, and building a stronger and a more secure grid. Solar innovation also continues to drive the cost of renewable energy lower, helping the environment and also helping consumers. My state of Utah is a national leader in solar development. We rank 10th in the country for solar production, on our way to producing 1,079 megawatts of solar energy in the next 5 years. Our sports stadiums are powered by solar, and solar has invested nearly $2.63 billion into the Utah economy alone. In my district, the solar energy industry supports 40 companies, employs 6,000 individuals, powers 14,000 homes, and produces 72 megawatts of electricity. Additionally, this bill enjoys the support of the Solar Energies Industry Association, the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Environmental Defense Fund, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the American Chemical Society. Climate change presents us with very real threats. However, it also presents an opportunity to create a renewable energy economy. This bill addresses climate change while creating jobs, securing our grid, and helps to produce clean, reliable energy. I look forward to a discussion with my colleagues today, welcome input on how this legislation might be improved to garner broader consensus, and I urge a yes vote on H.R. 3597. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. McAdams. Does anyone wish to be heard on, or be recognized for comment? If not, then we'll proceed with the amendments in order of the roster. Amendment number 1 offered by Mr. Perlmutter.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado.
I ask unanimous consent to dispose of the reading, and without objection so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, and I want to applaud Representative McAdams for his work introducing this bill, and to the Science Committee for putting together a strong bipartisan reauthorization for DOE's solar energy research programs. I represent Golden, Colorado, and the National Renewable Energy Lab. NREL is the premier energy efficiency and renewable energy lab in the world. The lab first opened as the Solar Energy Research Institute in 1977 after passage of the Solar Energy Research, Development, and Demonstration Act of 1974. And time to time I put up this chart. Back when NREL was opened, it was $76 per watt for solar, silicon-based solar. Today, it's 30 cents. So there has been tremendous development and tremendous strides made in connection with solar research, solar energy research, and the opportunity that it provides for us to the energy grid. Since it's opened its doors, NREL has pushed the boundaries of our understanding of solar energy technologies and helped dramatically reduce costs of manufacturing, installation, and integration of solar technology onto the grid. And that's why I'm pleased the Science Committee is taking steps to modernize and reauthorize DOE's solar research programs. My amendment is very simple. It clarifies the research areas in the bill to ensure low-cost, thin-film solar technologies are included in DOE's research. NREL has excelled at materials science and understanding how new materials like perovskite can be used to open new doors for commercial applications of solar technologies. One company taking advantage of these opportunities is Ascent Solar, which is in my district. They manufacture flexible solar panels in the United States with a wide range of applications, and they partner with NREL and DOE to better understand the fundamental materials science and the impacts of various techniques and processes on efficiency and reliability. I'd say to my friend from Oklahoma, based upon his opening, that we need to continue this research, and I appreciate his desire to keep an eye on the budget. We all must do that. But I would say to my friend that particularly in solar and wind, it isn't what's the percentage above what it was in 2019. It's whether we were underfunded in these areas to begin with, which we have been because of the state of our budget over the last number of years. And I'd say to my friend that we're going to be looking at a defense bill of $750 billion for 1 year. This addition under this bill, the authority, would be 750 years worth of that. And as to the tax cut we had a couple years ago, where it hits the deficit for about $2 trillion, that's 2,000 years. So to my friend, I appreciate his budget hawk approach, but here we've underfunded from the beginning. We've seen tremendous strides, and this country faces some real issues with its climate, and solar is one of the best places we can make advances in terms of energy production, as well as dispensing with pollution into our atmosphere. And with that, I'd yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course, I'd yield to my friend from Oklahoma.
I would simply note to my dear friend that I intend to vote with him on his amendment. And I'm proud that he was listening when I observed that there are only so many resources, and we have to be careful in our allocations.
I'd say to my
I suspect we'll have more discussions as the morning goes along.
Reclaiming my time, I always listen to my friend from Oklahoma. So I never disregard anything he has.
So would the gentleman yield one more time? Stop while you're ahead, my friend.
I'd yield back to, I thank you. I urge passage of my amendment, and I yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much. I ask unanimous. Wait a minute. Is there further discussion on this amendment?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word. I want to thank the gentleman.
You recognize.
I want to thank the gentleman from Colorado for his amendment expanding research to include thin-film solar technologies. I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
Any other comments? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Birthday. Give him a break.
Okay, the next amendment is Mr. Lipinski's amendment. And
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 2, offered by Mr. Lipinski of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to begin by thanking Mr. McAdams for introducing this important legislation today. Tomorrow, in the Research and Technology Subcommittee, we'll be holding a hearing on innovations in sustainable chemistry. We'll be hearing from witnesses about a bill that I introduced, H.R. 2051, the Sustainable Chemistry Research and Development Act. As we consider this bill today on solar energy research, I'm offering an amendment which encourages the Department of Energy's partners to incorporate green engineering and sustainable chemistry principles when carrying out research activities described in this bill. The solar industry is generally good for the environment. As solar energy utilization grows, we see a reduction in emissions contributing to climate change. However, as the U.S. Energy Information Administration indicates, some of the materials currently used in solar panels are toxic. In addition, some solar energy systems rely on hazardous fluids to transfer heat, which often contains heavy metals. This means we need to be concerned about the disposal of solar panels and energy storage materials once they reach the end of their usefulness. As the Department of Energy continues to support research on new solar energy materials, I want to ensure that researchers consider the environmental impacts of the materials they use, and where appropriate, prioritize the use of environmentally friendly alternatives, or consider technologies to recover and recycle materials. Additionally, we must encourage research into minimizing inefficiencies and waste in the manufacturing process for these panels. This amendment will provide flexibility for the Department of Energy to further research in all of these areas as appropriate. I want to thank the committee for considering this amendment, ask my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is Mr. McNerney's amendment, offered from the gentleman from California.
I thank the chair, and I want to introduce.
Clerk will report.
I have an amendment. Excuse me. Thank you. I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment number 3, offered by Mr. McNerney.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading, and without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
I thank the chair. For millions of Americans, solar energy is helping households make ends meet, driving down energy costs. But for many working families, buying rooftop solar is out of reach because they live in apartments, rent their homes, or can't afford the upfront investment. Community solar extends economic assistance to solar power everyone by allowing communities to co-invest in a solar array and share the benefits. Some community solar projects have reduced energy bills by as much as 80%. By extending the solar energy to more families, we are bolstering renewable energy that reduces carbon emissions while helping families save money on their monthly bills. This is a win-win for the climate and for the economy. This amendment that I'm proposing will prioritize grants that promote solar in low-income communities and those disproportionately burdened by pollution. This amendment will ensure that clean energy and community solar projects are available for communities that need it the most. I also want to introduce, for the record, a letter from Representative Ben Ray Lujan, who has been a leader on this issue, to the chair and ranking member requesting that the language be included in the underlying bill.
Without objection.
I thank the chair and I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Next is a Norman amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 4, offered by Mr. Norman.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading, and without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. I believe by adopting my amendment, this committee could move forward in bipartisan legislation today. My amendment moderates the spending levels included in the underlying bill, offering a realistic approach to funding critical R&D. My amendment also adds a requirement that no additional funds are authorized to carry out this legislation. Instead, it directs the Department of Energy to fund the work authorized under this legislation using amounts already appropriated to fund its research and development programs. The DOE's and Renewable Energy EERE is the largest applied energy program at the department, funded at almost $2.4 billion in fiscal year 2019, which is more than all of the R&D funding for DOE's other applied energy offices combined. DOE's solar energy research already receives over $246 million in annual funding from within this program. I'm supportive of solar energy research, and I would welcome the opportunity to support a bill that takes a targeted, more gradual approach. But a 33% increase in spending is not only unreasonable, it's irresponsible. Our job here in Congress is to spend limited tax dollars wisely, just like so many of our constituents do every day. We don't have unlimited resources, and we can't promise to spend more money we don't have. Instead, let's prioritize what we have and make sure we're investing limited federal dollars in programs that benefit the American taxpayer. By making smart investments in the fundamental science that will drive innovation in solar energy technologies and funding gradual limited growth in applied research, we can help create a diverse, clean energy portfolio without more reckless spending. We don't need to drive up the national debt and subsidize industry to support renewable energy technology. I encourage my colleagues to support this common sense amendment so we can work together to support the next generation of solar technologies. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Norman. I recognize myself to make some brief comments on the amendment. I oppose this amendment because it contradicts the funding levels set by the House-passed appropriations bill and effectively cuts solar energy innovation funding compared to 2019 enacted levels when considering the annual cost of research inflation. Also, stating that no additional funds are authorized to be appropriated is contradictory to the clear direction of the bill, which authorizes a modest 5% annual increase in funds for solar energy R&D activities. I really believe that this legislation would get support from my Republican colleagues, and many of my friends across the aisle have recently been touting innovation as the best way for us to address climate change. So here we are with a bipartisan bill authorizing fairly modest growth in solar energy innovation. It's been endorsed by the leading industrial and environmental organizations of this field. I would note that if my friends can't support this bill as one small element in an agenda to address our changing climate and grow a strong clean energy industry in the U.S., then I'm at a loss as to what can we support. Nonetheless, I will continue to work with my Republican colleagues to find a common ground on these important areas. Is there further discussion on this amendment? If not, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor? Who? Mr. Perlmutter is recognized.
Thank you. And just, I appreciate the chairwoman's comments, and to my friend, Mr. Norman, I would just say, look, I believe that we've underfunded this entire area for a very long time, and to say, well, it's an increase, and therefore, you know, we ought to be able to do it under the same numbers. We've been underfunding this area despite the great strides we've seen in savings to all Americans. So it isn't just a question of, is this an increase to the federal budget? You also got to look at the decrease in the cost of energy production to all of us, and the associated help to the climate that we see with this kind of technology. So I would say to my friend, you know, we've got a lot of work to do on battery storage. There's a lot of applied science that remains to continue to reduce these costs to benefit all of us and to benefit our environment generally. So I respectfully oppose my friend's amendment to hold this to level funding, because I think that's a very big mistake. And I'd yield back.
Thank you very much.
Madam.
The chair recognizes Mr. Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to support my colleague's amendment. You know, I'm a strong supporter of research and development, and as mentioned here earlier, we've reduced the cost per watt from what, $79 down to 30 cents over that period of time. So my thought is that a 33% increase over the 5 years is pretty significant, and Mr. Norman's amendment approaches that in what I think is a more reasonable and a more practical rationale for increasing that research and development. So I thank you.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chairman?
Mr. McAdams.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to also underline the point that you made. I thank the gentleman from South Carolina for his amendment, and I understand his commitment to fiscal responsibility. That's also something that's incredibly important to me, and I think we do need to do a better job as a Congress of being aware of and reducing the deficit. But I'd also like to remind the committee that this legislation is authorizing, not appropriating funds. And I believe this legislation is important because how else do we show our commitment to a diverse energy platform if we are not willing to invest in it? This legislation will have a positive economic impact for consumers in the short, medium, and long term, and also for the American economy as it creates jobs and stimulates growth in renewable energy. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Let me just say that, you know, there's nobody more committed to solar energy's progression and research and use than I am. I'm a developer. We attract industry to not only South Carolina, but hopefully all over. And you got to remember, you know, the solar research is already receiving $246 million. And if we pass this, what we're doing is sending a strong message to the private sector. You need to get involved. It's in your best interest because they're going to let government and let, I guess, not shoulder the responsibility they have to. And a lot of this will be an internal cut that if we pass this, will be administratively. It's not going to harm the program. If it did, I would never put this up. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I just would point out to my friend that much of this research that is underway today is public-private in nature. So it isn't simply the National Renewable Energy Lab or DOE doing it, but it is in partnership with various businesses and, you know, technology companies as a way to continue to drive down the price for all Americans, for all consumers. And so I just say to my friend, I understand you'd like to see the private sector involved, and I would say they are as part of this whole process. That's the applied element of this. This is both straight science and hard science as well as applied science, which then benefits us because it comes to market. And with that, I yield back to my friend.
I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone seeking recognition on this amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair, could I request a recorded vote on that amendment?
Yes, we'll roll the recorded votes until later, but we will have a recorded vote. Amendment number 2 is also Mr. Norman's. It's an amendment offered from the gentleman from South Carolina. He's recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 5, offered by Mr. Norman.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense for the reading. Without objection, show order. The chair recognizes the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. My amendment would add a simple, straightforward sense of Congress to this legislation, highlighting the need for a balanced energy portfolio. We hear a lot from our colleagues today about the need for more federal investments in clean energy technology. But while most Americans think of renewable power when we talk about clean energy, the truth is that growth in cheaper, cleaner natural gas power has been the driving force in reducing emissions. And nuclear power is the only baseload, zero emissions technology on the market today. We can't power our economy with just one form of energy, and we aren't going to stop using fossil fuels or nuclear power anytime soon. So let's invest in a balanced energy portfolio, prioritizing the early stage research that requires federal government support. I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I recognize myself to briefly speak on the amendment. And I want to note that I support an all of the above clean energy innovation strategy, which is why we're going to mark up the fossil and wind energy R&D bills today as well. The committee has also held hearings that together cover a wide range of energy innovation topics, including a hearing in April on the domestic nuclear energy. Going forward, the committee is committed to addressing the research needs of all promising clean energy technologies and sources. Is there any other discussion on this amendment? Hearing none, then the vote.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Request to strike the last word.
Yes, you recognize Ms. Kess.
So I want to thank Mr. Norman for the amendment, and I agree with the principle of this, that we need to, as Hamlet said, or Horatio, whoever it was, there's more complexity than is dreamt of in our philosophies here. We need to invest in a whole lot of technologies. If this were a bill about getting to zero CO2, I would quite support the idea that we need to not be prescriptive on paths, but rather very clear on goals and let markets figure out how to allocate resources. But since this is a bill solely about solar research, and since the people who are tasked with discerning our will are going to look back to the language to try to understand our intent, I don't understand why in this bill we are saying something about other non-solar technologies. And so while I certainly support the idea of doing research into solar and a whole host of fossil energy efficiency programs, it seems to me that this is not germane to the bill. And so I would oppose putting it here, but would look forward to working to make sure we include this in other research priorities. And with that, I yield back.
Any further discussion on this amendment?
Madam Chair.
Mr. McAdams.
Thank you. I would just echo the sentiments that have already been expressed. That I want to thank the gentleman from South Carolina for his amendment. I don't believe his amendment is inconsistent with the goals of this legislation. I agree, in fact, that we do need, in order to get to a renewable energy economy, we need an all-of-the-above energy portfolio. So I don't believe that this amendment is harmful per se, but I do believe that the topic is being addressed in related legislation that will be discussed today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other recognition sought? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Further proceedings on this is postponed until after we have the votes. We will now consider H.R. 3607, the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act of 2019. The clerk will report the bill.
Committee print of H.R. 3607, a bill.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself to speak on the amendment, speak on the bill. I'm pleased that we are now considering H.R. 3607, the Bipartisan Fossil Energy Research and Development Act of 2019, led by my Dallas-Fort Worth colleague, Mark Wiese, which I was very happy to co-sponsor along with my colleagues of the Energy Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Lamb, our Environmental Subcommittee Chairwoman, Ms. Fletcher, Congressman David Swackert, and Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. As we all know, historically, fossil fuels have served as a primary source of U.S. energy, as they have provided reliable power at low cost. My home state of Texas has played an important role in the fossil fuels industry as the leading producer of crude oil and natural gas in the U.S. However, as our nation's priorities have evolved, we are now focused not only on using energy sources that provide low-cost, dispatchable energy, but also ensuring that these are clean sources of energy. That's why we must strengthen our investment in the Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy, which supports research to address the environmental impacts of fossil fuels. H.R. 3607 sets forth a bold research agenda for important topics like carbon capture, storage, and utilization, carbon removal, and methane leak detection and mitigation. This bill has been endorsed by a broad range of prominent stakeholders from the fossil fuel industry sector, labor, and environmental organizations, including the Carbon Utilization Research Council, the Carbon Capture Coalition, Carbon 180, the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Environmental Defense Fund, the American Federation of Government Employees, ClearPath, the Bipartisan Policy Center, Third Way, the Clean Air Task Force, the American Chemical Society, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Given this broad support for this bipartisan bill, I hope that each of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will strongly support advancing H.R. 2607 this morning. Does anyone wish to be recognized? Ms. Fletcher.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. I move to strike the last word. I'd like to thank you, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas, for including this important bill in today's markup. H.R. 3607, the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act of 2019, is an important step in continuing to develop carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology, and to increase the export of this technology, equipment, and services from the United States. In particular, our investment in carbon capture, utilization, and storage research has the potential to make viable transformative solutions that go to the heart of one of our greatest challenges, carbon emissions and climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has identified the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels and related global greenhouse emission pathways. In its report, the IPCC laid out 4 different potential pathways to reach the goals of reducing carbon emissions, and 3 of the 4 scenarios required the successful development and deployment of CCUS. All 3 scenarios requiring CCUS were economically much cheaper than the plan without, and there are 3 main problems with CCUS currently: the limited pace of current deployment, the evolution of CCS technology associated with deployment, and the lack of incentives for large-scale implementation. CCS has the greatest power for the industrial sector. While solar and wind have increased in the power sector, industrial emissions are responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gases globally. Power demand in the industrial sector is also likely to increase dramatically between now and 2050. CCUS has a definitive role to play here, especially in certain high-carbon emitting industries. The government has a role to play here in driving innovation through public-private partnerships, through funding incentives, and through this critical research. We've already seen promising examples of the potential CCUS technology in the Houston area that I represent, along with my colleagues on this committee, and I believe it is in everyone's interest to invest in this critical research. As the representative for the energy capital of the world in Houston, Texas, I urge my colleagues to vote in support of this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further requests for recognition?
Madam Chair, is it in order to submit an amendment at this time?
We're going to amendments. If you
Okay.
we will proceed now with the amendments. In order of the roster, and Mr. Weber has the first amendment.
Madam Chair,
There's an amendment after this.
yes.
Amendment number 1, offered by Mr. Weber.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. My amendment to H.R. 3607, the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act of 2019, would modify the bill to allocate more moderate funding levels and address the unnecessary narrowing of the mission of the fossil energy research programs included in the underlying bill. Once again, like the ranking member, I do believe, along with the chairwoman, we have a bipartisan bill within our reach. While H.R. 3607 includes many programs that I support, like innovative research in carbon capture technologies, indeed, we have a very large carbon capture sequestration plant in our district, like carbon utilization research and natural gas production R&D, the spending authorized in the bill is simply not realistic. This legislation would increase total spending in this area to over $1 billion with the B dollars by fiscal year 2024, which is a 36% increase from enacted levels. This level of funding is aspirational at best and irresponsible at its worst. As has been cited earlier, our national debt is out of control and we just cannot increase spending for every program. We have to make choices about priorities and use our limited resources in the best way we can. This amendment also addresses another concern that I have with this legislation, and that is the narrowing of the mission goals within the fossil energy R&D program. The changes proposed to the mission goals in the majority's legislation would focus fossil R&D programs on almost entirely on emissions control technologies. And while I'm supportive of funding research to help us better capture, store, and utilize carbon, did I mention we have a facility in our district? This cannot be our only goal when it comes to energy technology. So accordingly, my amendment would restore important provisions authorizing DOE to conduct research on a broad range of production, on consumption, and on utilization technologies for fossil fuels. We could actually achieve those lower energy costs that our good friend from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, talked about earlier. It's our job in Congress to focus federal agencies on the best use of limited federal funding and to set clear priorities for agencies to develop innovative technologies. But we cannot increase every program by 30 to 40%, no matter how much and how nice that sounds. So I support aspects of the research programs authorized in this legislation, and my amendment allows for modest growth in funds authorized for fossil energy research in the years ahead. But we must be fiscally responsible, and most of all, we have to be honest and realistic about what we can truly achieve. So I believe this amendment is a common sense, fiscally responsible proposal, and I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. I oppose this amendment because it would limit support for research, development, and demonstration activities in this vital area. The funding levels authorized in this bill are consistent with testimony and recommendations that the committee has received from major energy industry organizations. As found in the 2018 Advanced Fossil Energy Technology Roadmap produced by the Carbon Utilization Research Council and the Electric Power Research Institute, for example. Major environmental organizations, including the National Resource Defense Council and the Environmental Defense Fund, has also endorsed the need for robust federal support to advance these technologies at a pace that would help mitigate the worst potential impacts of climate change. The overall levels for fossil energy R&D activities provided in this amendment are also inconsistent with the specific levels authorized to carry out the individual programs established in this bill. In other words, beginning in 2021 and all the way through 2024, the amounts authorized for each of the programs would add up to more than what would be authorized for fossil fuel energy R&D in total if this amendment were adopted. I'm sorry, but I just can't support a legislative language that defies basic arithmetic. Lastly, this amendment would eliminate several important provisions in the underlying bill that ensure that these federally supported activities focus on reducing the environmental impact of the extraction and use of fossil fuels. This is where taxpayer-funded R&D is most needed in the fossil energy sector and would have the largest public benefit. I yield back. Is there further discussion on this amendment? Anyone seeking recognition? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair, could we have a recorded vote on that amendment?
A recorded vote has been requested. It will be rolled with the rest of the votes. Thank you. Any further amendments? Foster.
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
I have an amendment. He has an amendment at the desk. The clerk is to report the amendment.
Amendment number 2, offered by Mr. Foster.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm introducing this amendment to add, quote, improving the separation and purification of helium from fossil fuel resources as an objective of DOE's fossil fuel research activities. Helium is a critically important element to a wide range of activities, not only party balloons and blimps, but quantum computers and other scientific research, magnetic resonance imaging machines for medicine, advanced nuclear reactors, pressurizing the fuel tanks of rockets prior to launch, but perhaps most importantly, of course, its use in superconducting particle accelerators, on which I've spent a big part of my career. Helium's ability, its chemical inertness and its ability to reach very low temperatures while remaining in a gaseous or fluid state attracts many commercial and institutional users. Unfortunately, our helium supply is dwindling, and a crippling shortage has been affecting university researchers, national laboratories, and a broad range of industries, including domestic manufacturing of semiconductors and fiber optic cables. Oil companies harvest helium trapped beneath the Earth's surface in natural gas chambers, but helium is very difficult to locate and often expensive to separate. Almost every known helium reserve was discovered by accident as a byproduct of natural gas extraction. The United States has been the largest producer of helium since 1925 because of a massive reserve found across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Much of this is stored in the Federal Helium Reserve, but the reserve is set to close down in 2021. This decreasing supply of helium has caused prices to double or even triple. The price uncertainty is especially difficult to accommodate for scientists who rely on helium for have fixed research grants, but must use those fixed grants to purchase helium. Additional research by the fossil fuel program at DOE is likely to improve the efficiency and lower the cost of helium extraction. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to direct the DOE to target a fraction of the fossil fuel research towards the critical issue of the plummeting helium supply. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Any further comments on the amendment? Hearing no requests, the vote then will occur on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The next amendment is Mr. Lucas, the ranking member, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 3, offered by Mr. Lucas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. My amendment will authorize a research and development program to develop carbon capture technologies for natural gas-powered systems. It would amend the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act to add to the text of H.R. 3828, a bipartisan bill I co-sponsored with Representative Dan Crenshaw of Texas, by establishing a dedicated program at the Department of Energy to focus on natural gas power systems. This amendment will help make carbon capture more efficient, affordable, and accessible for American industry. My amendment also directs the Department of Energy to partner with the industry and ensure that the technologies developed through this research program can be demonstrated in commercially feasible scales. This will bridge the gap between the lab and the market, allowing industry to take the lead in proving these innovative technologies can work in the real world. Modernizing energy production and reducing greenhouse gas emissions requires realistic solutions that don't prohibit effective fuel sources or inhibit economic growth. Clean, efficient, affordable natural gas is a critical component of America's energy portfolio, and by establishing a program focused on developing carbon capture technology for these systems, we have the potential to dramatically reduce greenhouse emissions, making natural gas an even cleaner energy source. This is common sense policy that can benefit our environment while using American resources and keeping our energy affordable. I believe we can all support these goals, and I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I recognize myself to discuss the amendment. I think this amendment is a constructive amendment and could be a good addition to the underlying bill. I'd also like to thank the gentleman for making a small change to the amendment at my request. Natural gas carbon capture is an increasingly important topic given the recent and ongoing dramatic expansion of our natural gas power plant fleet. I think this amendment provides helpful guidance to to the department of focus more of its carbon capture efforts on natural gas plants moving forward. Unfortunately, carbon capture technology development has in the past been focused more on coal power, and this amendment takes us a step to balance the department's portfolio in this regard. I would note, however, that if the amendment by the gentleman from Texas, which reduces the authorization for the overall fossil program, were to pass, it would be difficult to impossible for the department to allocate the necessary funds to carry out the amendment that we are now considering. I do think the amendment is constructive. I'm inclined to support the amendment, and it would be my sincere hope that if this amendment is adopted, and my friend, the ranking member, would go on to support the underlying bill that he's amending. Thank you. Now, is there any further discussion on the amendment? Yes, that's, who is that?
Good question from Mr. Lucas. In general, I support the amendment. The language specifies, though, that the qualifying technology is carbon dioxide produced during the generation of electricity from natural gas power systems. There is fairly significant CO2 release from process use of natural gas, whether for thermal use or industrial processing, which in my view is going to be much harder to decarbonize than the electric sector. Is there a reason why this is limited to electricity generation? And if not, would you be willing to consider a friendly amendment between now and when we get to the floor to incorporate all the uses of natural gas in our energy sector, not simply limited to electricity generation?
While the intent of the amendment is to focus on the particular sector, I very much appreciate the point the gentleman raises and would be willing to discuss as we move forward on this the nature of all these other issues too.
Okay, because the technology is essentially the same. There may be different scales in different locations, but CO2 in air doesn't particularly matter how the combustion process happened. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further requests for time? Hearing none, then the amendment seems to be constructive. I'm inclined to support it. And all those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, and he's recognized to offer his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairwoman Johnson, I want to thank you for advancing this bill, which I support. H.R.
Clerk
36...
will report the amendment.
Okay.
Amendment number 4, offered by Mr. Tonko of New York.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense of the reading, and without objection, so ordered, I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you. I thank you again for your support. H.R. 3607 already includes language calling for RD&D to support natural gas turbine combined cycle efficiency of 67% or combustion turbine efficiency of 50%. That is a target the gas turbine industry and I both support. This amendment would expand upon this provision in the underlying bill. It is based upon legislation that I've introduced with Congressman McKinley of West Virginia for many years, and it has passed this House on multiple occasions in the past. Expanded government investment in research of gas turbine technology will lead to more American jobs, increased American global competitiveness, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. With natural gas providing the largest source of United States electricity generation, even a 1% fleet efficiency improvement would be very beneficial for mitigating climate change. Right now, the most efficient new turbines are around low to mid 60% efficient. The 67% combined cycle goal can be done, but not without technology improvements. This amendment would outline a few of the key program elements of this research effort. It could be achieved through development of high-temperature materials, improved heat transfer capability, manufacturing technology required to construct complex parts, and advanced controls and systems integration. This amendment also puts emphasis on creation or retention of jobs in the United States and promoting U.S. technology leadership. Without an expansion of our government funding in gas turbine R&D, U.S.-based manufacturers will lose the competitive edge that they have long held over foreign manufacturers. Other countries are making the investments in this given technology. Efficiency must be our fuel of choice. The cleanest and cheapest kilowatt of electricity is the one that we do not use, enabling the U.S. manufacturers to continue to design and manufacture the world's most efficient turbines will ensure that it is an American-made product that is exported around the world. With that, I encourage members to support this amendment. I yield back, and again, thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Lucas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Johnson. I want to thank Representative Tonko for offering this amendment. This provision would clearly authorize research and development to improve the efficiency of gas turbines. It's critical that we maintain American leadership in this technology, and DOE is the right partner to work with industry on the goals outlined in the bill. I thank you again, and I encourage my colleagues to support the gentleman's amendment, and yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Weber.
I want to thank Mr. Tonko also, and I appreciate the amendment. I intend to vote for it, and I hope our colleagues will. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? Hearing none, then the vote recurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Amendment. We'll take a recess for 5 minutes.
You just barely made it, man. I know. I was going to have to introduce your amendment for you.
There you go. I could have only relied on Madam Carney.
If you would, relying on her is dangerous. Yes, she's just not very reliable.
Committee will come to order.
Start on
Mr. Weber.
Yeah, we'll start on Weber. The ranking member's coming back?
He's coming back.
Okay.
The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber. He is recognized to offer his amendment. I have an amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Thank you. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 5, offered by Mr. Weber.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, ma'am. My amendment would add a sense of Congress to this legislation, which actually highlights the important role that fossil fuels play in growing the American economy. America has vast resources in fossil energy, and the incredible growth in oil and gas production is providing an affordable, reliable, cleaner source of energy to countries around the entire world. If we want our country to remain the leader of the free world, we cannot afford to leave these resources in the ground. And regardless of what some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle like to often say about fossil fuels, these resources are not the enemy. Fossil fuels provide power for our people, provide power for our economy, and provide power for our military, which is national security. While I believe that we need, rightfully so, we need to invest in innovation that benefits all kinds of energy, I think it would be irresponsible to forget what an important role fossil fuels play in powering our country. I want to encourage my colleagues to support my amendment. It's the sense of Congress, and I want to yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, gentleman.
Madam Chairwoman, move to strike the last word.
Chair recognizes Mr. Lamb.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I agree with my colleague from the great state of Texas about the importance of fossil fuels in our economy today and tomorrow. However, I will be opposing his amendment because it is not specific enough. As the chairman of the subcommittee that marked up the underlying fossil bill, I can say the fossil bill itself is our statement about the importance of fossil fuels. In other words, we are willing to invest record levels in the research and development of carbon capture technology and other ways to improve and make more efficient the use of fossil fuels, not only for the electrical grid, but in the transportation sector and in manufacturing as well. We can't blind ourselves to the reality that no matter how important fossil fuels are and will continue to be, we have to do things differently. And someone is going to win that race, whether it's us or China or any other competitor is going to figure out how to manufacture this carbon capture technology and change their manufacturing process and electrify more of their grid. We would like it to be those of us in the United States, which is what is driving this bill. So there's no disagreement over the importance of fossil fuels, but we don't believe they need to be singled out with a general statement when the bill itself reflects the priority of us putting our money where our mouth is. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I thank the gentleman from Texas as well. And I would like to recognize myself for a comment on this amendment. It is unusual to see a sense of Congress amendment proclaiming the importance of fossil fuels submitted to a markup of a bill which proposes to significantly increase our nation's investment in fossil fuel research and development. I suspect that my friend from Texas has submitted this amendment to soften his apparent opposition to the underlying bill. I do not intend to support the amendment, and if you support fossil fuels, then you should support the underlying bill, which provides real support to the Department of Energy's fossil fuel programs. Supporting this amendment doesn't help the industry at all. I also feel that providing unconditional support to fossil fuels is irresponsible given that we know about the dangers of climate change. I support the underlying bill precisely because the Department's fossil fuel program seeks to responsibly utilize fossil fuels by researching ways to mitigate the pollution for these fuels that these fuels produce. If you really support fossil fuels, then the real way to show that support, it isn't with a sense of Congress, it's supporting the passage of this bill. I yield that and call for any further discussion. Ms. Bonamici is recognized.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so much. And with all due respect to my friend and colleague from Texas, I am opposed to this amendment. This is not the message we need to be sending to the American public right now. With all we know from the IPCC report, from the Fourth National Climate Assessment, when people are out there around the country with rising temperatures and more extreme weather events and ocean acidification, we need to be talking about how we can transition from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy. So I am planning to support the underlying bill because it is better than the status quo, and I think it's going to help us answer some of the questions about existing fossil fuel sources. But to send a message now that fossil fuels are essential is not what we need to be sending, the message we need to be sending to the American public. So with all due respect to my colleague, I am going to be opposing this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Caston.
Thank you. I also oppose because I think the fundamental premise here is categorically wrong. There is absolutely no argument that fossil fuels are essential for U.S. economic growth. What is essential for U.S. economic growth is access to useful energy. As my friend Amory Levins is fond of saying, what everybody wants is a cold shower and a warm beer. They don't care how the shower got cold. They don't care how the shower got warm, or how the beer got cold. Hopefully not the other way around. At the same time, even if you like.
Will the gentleman yield?
Well, not until I've had another beer.
I can't help you with the shower, but the beer I can.
But my more serious point is our standard of living, and indeed I think there are very good arguments that economic growth has been contingent on providing steadily lower costs of delivered useful energy. One of the ways we have provided lower costs is with fossil energy. Another way we've provided lower costs is by using a lot less fossil energy to deliver the same amount of useful energy. And the underlying bill does that exactly, but saying that it is that fossil fuels are essential for growth essentially conflates the back end of the process, which we care about, with the input, which is largely irrelevant.
Okay.
Thank you, and with that I will yield.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Perlmutter. You recognize.
So I would just say to my friend, Mr. Weber, listening to this conversation, I found the discussion is about the importance, and I agree to the importance, but I don't think your amendment uses the right term, and you use the word essential, and I would see if my friend would agree to change essential to important, and I'd ask for unanimous consent to that, and if not, I've got a secondary amendment that would change essential to important.
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, I do.
Does the gentleman agree that as a matter of national security, fossil fuel is essential?
I agree it's important to a whole range of things. But I also agree with Mr. Caston that we've been working for decades now to find other ways to power this nation, and we're doing a pretty good job finding those other ways. But clearly, I think it's important to the whole mix, and I think that's what the conversation here is about. Now, so I'm just suggesting to my friend that this amendment would pass with the word important and not essential.
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, I do.
So you're asking me to concur with your amendment to my amendment to change the word from essential to important?
Yeah, I am asking my friend to agree to that.
Well, okay. I'm hearing that you have to offer the amendment before we can amend the amendment, I guess. But in the spirit of bipartisanship, Ed, let me just say that I think bipartisanship is essential.
I think it's very important, too.
And so I yield back.
The chair is going to suspend this discussion until the preparation of the amendment and then recognize Mr. Byer.
I move to strike the last word, Madam Chair.
Get the amendment ready. Mr. Byer is recognized. Mr. Byer is recognized. We'll get back to the amendment.
Okay, thank you. I would like to speak out against my friend's amendment, only because while it is important and perhaps even essential today, on Wednesday, that we continue to use fossil fuels, it's also essential that we continue, that we one day soon not use fossil fuels at all. And there are many jurisdictions, for example, my home city of Alexandria, that's committed to fossil fuel electricity, fossil fuel-free electricity by 2035. Automobile manufacturers around the world are moving to fossil fuel-free automobiles. We recognize that despite the enormous contributions that fossil fuels have made for economic development so far, there are also enormous costs that are already coming around the world from the use of fossil fuels and the development of greenhouse gases. In that balance, we recognize historically what fossil fuels have contributed and have to look forward to a time when we use no fossil fuels whatsoever. So glorifying this or putting this in the law as essential is a move in the fundamentally wrong direction. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further comments? Mr. Babbitt.
I had not intended to make a comment here, but with all the give and take here, and I believe that bipartisanship is definitely an essential ingredient as well to have in this committee. But being from the 36th district of the Lone Star State of Texas, it's interesting and curious to hear that we want to take the word essential away from fossil fuels because of the tens of thousands of jobs that are being taken and offered by companies that are in my district as well as in Mr. Weber's district that are totally dependent upon cheap feedstocks to continue. And that feedstock is natural gas. And the story of cheap natural gas is a very historical, interesting story in itself. When we were supposed to have been at peak oil back in the 1980s, that all fossil fuels were done, that we would need to start weaning ourselves off of them because there wasn't going to be enough left to run our economy, and it was absolutely necessary that we go to alternative types of fuels. And I am totally in favor of alternative forms of fuel, but to say that fossil fuels are not essential, at least for the next decades, and that's plural, I think would be a very erroneous statement. In fact, if we weaned ourselves off of fossil fuels, the state of Texas might even just dry up. We have more petrochemical refining facilities than any other place, and not only in the country, but in the world. And as I said, thousands and thousands of people's employment and livelihoods are dependent upon that. And so I just wanted to put my 2 cents in, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now will move back to the amendments, and our chair recognizes Mr. Perlmutter.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd first have asked for unanimous consent to change the word essential to important in Mr. Weber's amendment.
The amendment is before us.
I object to the unanimous consent request, Madam Chair.
There's an objection to unanimous consent.
So then unanimous consent's not given, so I have a secondary amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the Weber amendment offered by Mr. Perlmutter.
Mr. Perlmutter is recognized.
Thank you. And we've had discussion about this. It changes Mr. Weber's, the secondary amendment changes the word essential to important so that it reads, it is the sense of Congress that power produced from fossil fuels is important for maintaining the economic growth, global competitiveness, and prosperity of the United States, which I know some on my side might say is still too strong a term. Others, Mr. Weber, Dr. Babin may believe that it's not strong enough, but I think it really does reflect what's in this bill and what this committee sees on the horizons, and so I would offer my amendment.
Parliamentary inquiry, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Does the gentleman need to withdraw his prior amendment before submitting a second amendment?
No.
I withdrew my unanimous consent request
Yes.
because there was an objection.
I understand, thank you.
So again, I offer my amendment to Mr. Weber's amendment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lucas.
Madam Chair, move to strike the last word. I would say to my colleague, who I'm very fond of, that this is an interesting point here, the question of essential versus important. I see where Mr. Weber's coming from, and those of us who, to make light of comments made earlier, who like to be cool in the summertime and warm in the winter, those of us who come from regions that are producers of these traditional forms of fuel, we view these resources as an essential tool to move the American economy forward until all the other alternatives become available. It seems, I think, almost illogical or impractical to say that we must abandon our tradition, our present driving force of energy, before we're even prepared to take those giant steps totally away from these sources of fuel. I think Mr. Weber is very accurate in offering this language to the bill. I think he's trying to state the obvious, and I would suggest to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, once again, whatever your perspective may be, fossil fuel is an essential resource to maintain our economic growth at the present time. It may not always be, but it is right now. And if you ask anyone who works in the industries in a variety of states around the country who bring those hydrocarbons up out of the ground using the latest technologies, they'll absolutely tell you that it's essential to their existence and to their communities. So respectfully, I would advocate a no vote on Mr. Perlmutter's second-degree amendment. And when it's appropriate, I'll ask for a roll call vote. And then I think as a body, we should, as a committee, we should just move on with the rest of this legislation. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I want to take a privilege of making a statement. The underlying legislation is for research. It is not to get rid of fossil fuels. I think in my statement I indicated earlier that for as long as we can see, fossil fuels will have a role. But because of the research we've gotten up to now, we know that we have to reduce many of the environmental contaminants as possible, which includes the research of cleaning up fossil fuels. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Fletcher.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. And I thank all of my colleagues for the discussion that we've had today, although I don't agree with all of the comments that have been made by some of my colleagues, including the comments about the future and what the future looks like with fossil fuels. I think that that's the purpose underlying this bill. Certainly, whether you call it essential or important, fossil fuels are a part of our daily existence. It is how we turn on the lights in this building. It's how we charge our iPhones. It's how we charge our cars that run on battery technology. And so we really have to take some time on this committee to understand the energy ecosystem from which all of these alternatives that we're talking about emerge from. I think right now that fossil fuels are essential, and I think that they are important, and I think that that is why we are discussing this underlying legislation, which I very proudly co-sponsored as a representative from the energy capital of the world, from Houston, Texas, neighbor with Mr. Babin and Mr. Weber and Mr. Olson. We understand the critical role that fossil energy produces in our country, and we also understand the role that we can have globally in leading to new technologies and to spreading more clean energy around the world. And natural gas is a big part of what we've done over the last decade here. We have gone from an era of energy scarcity to energy abundance, and it's thanks largely to natural gas that we have reduced carbon emissions in the United States over the last decade because we've transitioned from coal-fired plants to natural gas-fired plants. We are looking ahead, and we need on this committee to look ahead this year, 10 years, 20 years, and 50 years down the road, and we need to talk about what the appropriate mix is. But the underlying legislation here, which again I urge my colleagues to support, addresses this fundamental issue of being able to do the research on carbon capture to make it possible for us to produce these fuels in a cleaner way, hopefully getting to a place where we can do not only carbon capture in the industrial sector, but direct air capture and other things. And I think that whether you call it important or essential, I think we need to recognize that the underlying legislation that we're talking about is really important, and I encourage all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the research for the benefit of our economy and our ability to export these technologies around the world. And I do think that that is important to our global competitiveness and our prosperity, and it's also important to our ability to help countries around the globe reduce carbon emissions and achieve the objectives that I think we all believe in trying to combat climate change and global warming, and this is an important way to do it. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the people who are watching, I'm going to cover the amendment verbatim. Quote, "It is the sense of Congress that power produced from fossil fuels is essential for maintaining the economic growth, global competitiveness, and prosperity of the United States. The proposed amendment to this is to strike the word essential and instead put in the word important." And so I looked in the dictionary. What does the word essential mean? It is an adjective, quote, "absolutely necessary, extremely important," end quote. Not merely important, just important, extremely important. Let's look at national security and national defense. I would submit to everyone here that national security and national defense are essential, extremely important, not merely important, but extremely important to our, quote, "economic growth, global competitiveness, and prosperity of the United States," end quote, because without national security that is strong, then our economic growth, global prosperity, are all at risk. And so let's look at whether fossil fuels are essential to national security, which in turn is essential to economic growth, global competitiveness, and prosperity. What the gentleman in effect is saying by saying, no, it's just important, not essential, is that we don't need an Air Force because every single one of our fighter planes, every single one of our reconnaissance planes relies on fossil fuels. Now, I don't know about anybody else here on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, but I would submit that an Air Force is essential to national security, not merely important. Let's look at naval vessels. I don't know the numbers right offhand, but I would submit that probably roughly 90% of all of our naval vessels rely on fossil fuels. That's pretty essential, unless you want a naval force that is maybe 5 to 10%, a hollow shell of what we have now. Let's look at the Army. How many of our vehicles do not rely on fossil fuels? I would submit that almost all of our military Army vehicles, tanks and whatnot, Jeeps, rely on fossil fuels. So I would submit that the gentleman from Texas, Congressman Weber, is absolutely correct when he uses the word essential to describe the role of fossil fuels in maintaining the economic growth, global competitiveness, and prosperity of the United States of America.
And I will not concede that we do not need a United States military, because in effect, that's what this amendment to the amendment states. It is far more than merely important. It is essential. And I ask that we vote against this amendment offered that would strike the word essential and instead insert the word merely important. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? Request for recognition.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Weber.
move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from Alabama for those comments and those observations and the definitions, because words are important. They mean things. And when I speak, Madam Chair, I often say, when I speak to groups, being from Texas, and I would think that the two gentleladies from Texas, and even the one from Oklahoma and the gentleman from Pennsylvania, that energy would be extremely important to them. Indeed, if I may, the gentleman in Colorado, it would be essential in their communities. I often say to people that the things that make America great are the things that America makes. Now, how does America do that? It is with a reliable, affordable, dependable energy supply. And while we would all agree that the development of the green energy industry, the renewables, is extremely important, I want America to be in the lead of manufacturing and the technological leaders of innovation and development for that renewable industry. And let me just tell you, to be in the lead for that manufacturing and to develop the renewable industry, we are going to need fossil fuels to drive those factories. Indeed, fossil fuels are going to be essential in the development of the renewable industry. So that's the reason, one of the reasons for my insistence on using the word essential, because as the gentleman from Alabama pointed out, it is essential, not just to national security, but we're all concerned about CO2, carbon capture and sequestration. But to be able to develop that industry, we are going to need fossil fuels. And to think anything else, I believe, is a little less, it doesn't pass muster as an argument. And so, Madam Chair, I want to say that I hope my colleagues will vote against the word important, because as Mo Brooks pointed out, it is essential. National security, and as I point out, to the development of factories, the development of the renewable industry that we want to be in the lead of. And so I encourage my colleagues to vote against that amendment, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will.
And I just like to say to my friend from Texas and my friend from Alabama, one of the things that prompted me to use the word important is actually the military, which is looking for other ways to power itself than just fossil fuels, and has described climate change as a national security risk. So I'd say to my friends, I think I keep the essence of your amendment by using the word important, and with that, I'd yield.
Well, reclaiming my time then to the gentleman from Colorado, would you say that because of the threat of climate change, it's essential that we focus on this problem, or is it just simply important? Only important and essential. All right. Well, Madam Chair, I again urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment. I yield back.
Let me express my appreciation for the discourse we've had this morning on this subject, and we're going to now take action on the secondary amendment. But before we take that vote, I simply want to say that where we're going in this bill is not impacted at all by this amendment. I hope that all of you recognize how essential it is to pass the bill to show that we are giving attention to the areas so we can research how we can improve and do it better. We're not doing away with fossil fuels. We're trying to address what the science so far has shown as one of the areas that we need to address to protect our environment going forward. We are now going to call for the vote on the secondary amendment, changing essential to important. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
Ayes have it.
Madam Chair,
Madam Chair, we need a recorded vote on that, Madam Chair.
A recorded vote has been requested. We will take all of our votes at the end of the deliberation. Thank you very much. Now, we will move to H.R. 3609 for consideration. The Wind Energy Research and Development Act. The clerk will report the bill.
Committee print of H.R. 3609, a bill to provide for a program of wind.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read. I'll recognize Mr. Tonko for comments on this bill.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank you and Chairman Lamb for bringing up this bipartisan legislation to support wind energy innovation. I'm proud to have worked on numerous iterations of this bill going back to my freshman term in Congress. Since that time, the average cost of wind energy has dropped significantly, due in large part to sustained federal R&D investments. If progress continues, the Department of Energy predicts wind energy could provide 35% of America's electricity needs by 2050 and create 357,000 American jobs by 2030. The development of a domestic wind industry has been an amazing energy success story. Wind turbine technician is often cited as the second fastest growing job in the U.S. today. Private and public investments have enabled wind energy to capture market share and become cost competitive at a rapid pace, making wind one of the fastest growing sources of new electricity capacity in the United States. Today, wind power delivers some 6.6% of all U.S. utility-scale power generation, supporting over 114,000 American jobs and providing $1 billion of annual revenue for states, for communities, and for landowners. From 1999 to 2016, the height of wind turbines in the U.S. increased by 49%, and the blade length grew by 127%, enabling more efficient wind energy generation. Continued improvements in the technology will enable more regions of our nation to be strong candidates for developing wind resources in a cost-competitive fashion. Despite all of this recent success, it is clear that a sustained federal commitment to wind R&D is still critical. H.R. 3609, the Wind Energy Research and Development Act of 2019, supports wind energy research that will result in the accelerated development of innovative technologies, education of local communities, creation of more American jobs, and increased economic activity, especially in our rural communities. The bill would codify much of the work already being done by DOE's Office of Wind Energy under EERE. It authorizes DOE's Office of Wind Energy for 5 years, beginning at the level included in the fiscal year 20 House Energy and Water Appropriations Bill and rising by some 5% annually. Under this legislation, the Secretary of Energy is directed to tackle many of the challenges and barriers identified by the industry to advance further wind deployment. This includes improving the efficiency, reliability, and capacity of wind generation. It includes reducing cost of permitting, construction, operation, and maintenance of wind systems, conducting a wind energy technology validation and market transformation program, reducing barriers to widespread adoption of wind power, including grid integration and permitting issues tied to potential impacts on wildlife, radar systems, and airspace, and finally developing new wildlife impact mitigation technologies. DOE has maintained an industry-driven R&D roadmap based on its Wind Vision report, and I believe this bill reflects many of the industry-identified research priorities. The U.S. wind industry has made amazing progress over the past decade, but in many ways it is still a developing industry. It faces technology, regulatory, and market barriers that will make it more difficult to reach its full potential. Offshore, distributed, and other emerging wind energy technologies clearly need investments, which would be provided by this legislation, and a wide range of stakeholders agree. That is why a diverse coalition, including the American Wind Energy Association, the Distributed Wind Energy Association, EDF, NRDC, Bipartisan Policy Center Action, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Chemical Society, and Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions have all expressed support for this legislation. I encourage members to support this bill to enable America's energy innovators to develop the technology improvements and other breakthroughs needed to drive further wind energy cost reductions. If we do that, I know we can achieve ambitious deployment targets. With that, I thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. We're going to proceed right to the amendments in the order on the roster. And first amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, and he is recognized to offer that amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, offered by Mr. Byer.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to offer this amendment so that we may more effectively deploy offshore wind. I was proud and excited that Virginia was the first state to bid for an offshore wind lease in federal waters. However, Dominion Energy and BOEM were slow to get actual turbines up and running, and that was just for a test pilot. So the slowness of offshore wind development in Virginia is the perfect example of why this amendment is needed. Virginia has a complicated multi-ocean users, important marine ecosystems for our economy, fisheries, NASA, and of course the U.S. Navy out of Norfolk. Virginia also gets hurricanes, so we need to know what works, when, and how to make wind energy more cost-effective. This amendment would do that. It would establish a facility to conduct research, development, and demonstration projects for offshore wind energy development, working with the ocean and atmospheric science communities. There are really 3 aspects to the bill. The first is that the facility will be based in an offshore area to evaluate, test, and advance monitoring technologies to improve wind energy. Second, it's going to actually test the offshore wind energy technology so they can figure out how to finance them, insure them, and regulate them. And third, it will make sure that this research and development are for large-scale and full-scale offshore wind energy structures. We need cost-effective offshore wind where it makes sense, and this amendment would make that a reality. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed is nay. The ayes have it. The amendment's agreed to. The next amendment is Mr. Perlmutter, and the gentleman is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 2, offered by Mr. Perlmutter.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to applaud Representative Tonko for his work on this bill and the committee for taking up this bill focusing on DOE's wind energy research program. The growth in wind energy in the United States over the last couple decades has been tremendous. We've seen a dramatic reduction in the cost of wind turbines, which has enabled utilities to deploy hundreds of wind farms all across the country. The National Renewable Energy Lab is the home of the National Wind Technology Site, which is working with industry to improve manufacturing processes and materials to improve efficiencies and further reduce costs. In addition to the large wind farms we're all familiar with, DOE is also doing work with companies on smaller distributed wind technologies. One such company is Primus Wind Power, located in my district. Primus manufactures small-scale wind turbines, including 30 and 40 kilowatt-hour turbines for use off the grid, in remote locations, on boats, and more. My amendment clarifies the underlying bill's efforts to encourage research on distributed wind energy by specifying turbine designs, components, and manufacturing, in addition to microgrid applications as eligible research areas for distributed wind under the bill. This will ensure the most pressing distributed wind research areas are also addressed. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment and the underlying bill, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any requests for to be recognized? Oh, you're asking for time.
Yes. I would just simply note to my colleague, if he would yield, or if I'm allowed time, the golden rule of the majority: stop while you're ahead. Yield back.
The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposers vote no. The ayes have it, the amendment is adopted. The first amendment on the next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber. You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 3, offered by Mr. Weber.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. My amendment to H.R. 3609, the Wind Energy Research and Development Act of 2019, would modify the bill to allocate more moderate funding levels, offering a realistic approach to funding wind energy R&D, which by now we all know is essential. My amendment also adds a requirement that no additional funds are authorized to carry out this legislation. Instead, it directs the Department of Energy to fund the work authorized under this legislation using amounts already appropriated to the Department for Energy R&D without increasing overall spending. As my colleague, Mr. Norman, mentioned in his statement, EERE is funded at almost $2.4 billion with the B dollars. It is a budget that dwarfs those of the other applied research programs at the department. While there are significant opportunities for new and exciting research in areas like materials science and computing that can improve wind energy technologies, it is our job here in Congress to focus federal agencies on the absolute best use of limited federal funding. And let me add that Americans believe that that's essential. But we just can't magically increase overall spending every time we establish priorities for federal research programs. We have to focus the resources that we do have on work that industry cannot support. Now, I've said before that I think a case can be made for supporting aspects of the research programs authorized in this underlying legislation, which is why my amendment includes modest growth in funds allocated for wind energy over time. But it's very clear that DOE already receives ample funding to maintain this and its other energy technology programs without another top-line spending increase. We have to stop pretending that DOE can get a 30 to 40% increase for every program. It's just not realistic, and it's making promises to stakeholders that, quite frankly, we can't afford to keep. So instead, let's prioritize the fundamental research we all support and make modest investments to help innovative technologies succeed in the commercial market. I believe this is a common sense, fiscally responsible proposal, and I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much. I'm going to recognize myself to speak on the amendment. I oppose this amendment for largely the same reasons that I oppose an extremely similar amendment in the Solar Energy R&D Act. This amendment contradicts the funding levels set by the House-passed appropriations bill and effectively cuts wind energy innovation funding compared to the 2019 enacted levels because the annual funding increases over 5 years fall below research inflation levels. The proposed funding levels in this amendment do not sufficiently reflect the immense challenge that climate change poses and the need for well-funded clean energy research to ensure that the U.S. is a leader in the growing sector. Ignoring the funding levels provided in this amendment, the amendment still does not make sense in the context of the bill. Section 6 clearly authorizes additional funds for wind energy R&D activities, and at a relatively modest pace of a 5% increase annually. I might add, particularly given the potential for wind energy, stating that no additional funds are authorized to be appropriated is frankly contradictory to the clear direction of the bill. This is an authorization bill, not an appropriations bill. It is the job of this committee to provide long-term guidance to the annual appropriations process for areas under our jurisdiction. It is the Appropriation Committee's job to balance this and other committees' legislative guidance on an annual basis within an overall spending limit. The amendment undercuts the value of this committee's role in even providing such guidance. Is there any further discussion on this amendment?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe that we've discussed these issues rather thoroughly in the previous two bills. I suspect we all know where we stand on the subject matter. I would suggest to my colleagues that I will ask for a recorded vote on this amendment, and that would be the last recorded vote that I would ask for in this markup, and suggest to all my good friends that we just proceed with wrapping up our business today and yield back. Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. We will put that on the list for recorded votes that will occur later. We now have the next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the same gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, and he's recognized for this amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 4, offered by Mr. Weber.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objections to order. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, ma'am. This amendment would add a simple, straightforward sense of Congress to this legislation. It will highlight the need for investing in research that will lead to a balanced energy portfolio, as I mentioned earlier. We spend a lot of time in Congress discussing the need to make investments in clean energy technology. But more often than not, this conversation focuses on only renewable energy. The fact is that nuclear power remains the only reliable zero-emissions base load power which is deployed in the market today. And the boom in cleaner, more affordable American natural gas is driving down emissions all around the world. Advanced nuclear power and more efficient methods for producing and using natural gas will reduce our energy emissions even further, all the while reducing costs to the American consumer. Nuclear power and fossil energy are absolutely critical for our nation's future. Yes, renewable power is constantly improving, and with next-generation battery technologies, we will be able to use more of this power than ever before. But we cannot power our economy with only one form of energy. I would think we could and should all agree that we need to invest in innovation across a balanced energy portfolio, prioritizing the basic and early stage research that will only happen with federal government support. So I'd like to encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rebel. I will recognize myself to speak on this amendment. I'll just add that I support an all of the above clean energy strategy. An example of that commitment is the fossil fuel energy R&D bill that we just marked up today. That bill includes the goal of improving fossil energy efficiency. Hopefully, my Republican colleagues will also demonstrate their support for fossil energy by voting for that bill and not just a sense of Congress. Is there any further discussion on this amendment? Ms. Bonamici.
I move to strike the last word.
Generally,
Thank you, and with all due respect to the gentleman offering the amendment, I'm going to raise the same concern about this amendment that Mr. Caston raised about the similar amendment to the solar bill. This is a bill about wind energy research, so regardless of where you stand on the merits of the amendment, it just doesn't belong in this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you very much. Any other requests for time?
Hearing none, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Now, we are reporting the bill, and let's check on these amendments. Okay, we'll move now to, I think, the last bill, H.R. 335. We'll now consider the South Florida Clean Coastal Waters Act of 2019. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 335, a bill.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself for a brief statement on the bill. H.R. 335, the bipartisan South Florida Clean Coastal Waters Act, authorizes a scientific assessment and action plan to help address the problem of harmful algae blooms, or HABs, in South Florida. The assessment and action plan will be conducted by the Harmful Algae Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Task Force, which was established in 1998 and consists of 13 federal agencies. The assessment and action plan will help identify research gaps and detailed methods for mitigating and controlling the HABs and the hypoxia in South Florida. These documents will help serve as a blueprint for federal, state, and local decision makers and other stakeholders to coordinate actions to reduce these HABs and hypoxia in the region. South Florida has been suffering from the economically and ecologically costly blooms of harmful algae in both its marine and freshwater systems for years. It's only gotten worse in recent years. In 2018, a toxic red tide algae bloom persisted for well over a year. This bloom caused mass mortality of marine life, including dolphins, manatees, sea turtles, and hundreds of tons of dead fish to be collected from the beaches. It also cost local businesses at least $130 million of damages. Red tide and other types of HABs also propose health risk to humans from direct exposure and from eating infected seafood. This bill takes an important step in helping address the HABs and the hypoxia issue in South Florida, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Ms. Bonamici.
I move to strike the last word.
Chair recognizes Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Johnson and members. I'm the co-chair of both the House Oceans Caucus and the Congressional Estuary Caucus, so I'm glad our committee is considering this bipartisan legislation to strengthen efforts to predict and monitor harmful algal blooms in marine and freshwater systems. I was pleased to work with Congressman Posey to reauthorize the Harmful Algal Blooms and Hypoxia Research and Control Act in 2014 and again last Congress, but there are still opportunities to strengthen federal research efforts so we can better forecast and respond to blooms and recognize the distinct effects of harmful algal blooms and hypoxia on our ocean, estuaries, and waterways. The South Florida Clean Coastal Waters Act is an important step to improve regional assessments of these progressing environmental stressors. Harmful algal blooms, HABs, affect marine, coastal, estuary, and freshwater systems in all 50 states and U.S. territories. HABs can occur naturally and in response to certain environmental stressors such as increased nutrient runoff, pollution, and changes in water flow. The presence of these blooms is expected to increase substantially as a result of climate change and warming water temperatures. HABs result in significant economic losses for our communities that rely on fishing, shellfish harvesting, tourism, In Northwest Oregon, HABs have made our state's prized Dungeness crabs toxic. They've deprived fishing communities of income. The blooms have also stifled recreation activities on the Willamette River in Oregon and limited access to clean drinking water for residents of Salem, Oregon. And it wasn't too long ago that I heard about Lake Okeechobee in Florida being described as looking like a guacamole. And as the algae die and decompose, they consume oxygen, leaving waterways in a hypoxic state that can result in the formation of dead zones where marine life cannot survive. According to the West Coast Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Science Panel, Oregon now has this hypoxia season much like the wildfire season. We must improve our understanding of harmful algal blooms and develop a stronger strategy to help communities better predict and reduce the number of harmful algal blooms and hypoxic events. I'm working on another bill to strengthen federal support for these important research programs at NOAA, and I look forward to working with Congressman Posey, Congressman Mast, and others to clarify that the scientific assessments of marine and freshwater harmful algal blooms required under current law should have a regional focus so all communities, including those in the greater Everglades region, have the information necessary to respond to HABs and hypoxia. I thank Congressman Mast for his leadership on this bill. I urge all my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to Congressman Mast and to the chairwoman for your bipartisan work on this important issue. Last week, I visited Lake Hopatcong, which is the largest freshwater lake in New Jersey. In June, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection issued an advisory against swimming in Lake Hopatcong and 3 other New Jersey lakes due to a harmful algal bloom, or HAB. During the visit, I met with residents, business owners, and local leaders to discuss the impact this outbreak is having on the community. Imagine during the heat wave this past week, to live on a beautiful lake and not be able to jump in and swim, water ski, kayak, or paddleboard. But this is not just about the loss of a recreational resource. The economic ripple effects on local businesses are devastating as fewer and fewer visitors travel to the lake due to the HAB. Local marina owners have seen their boat rental businesses plummet to a few boats each weekend, despite the fact that the lake is still open to boats. The marina owners I spoke with estimate they are losing $20,000 per weekend. The story was the same for local restaurant owners. The community fears that the summer season is over for them already and worry about how this or future HAB outbreaks will continue to affect tourism in the coming years. So it's essential that we conduct additional research to better understand how and why these blooms form and to improve detection and forecasting of these events. I look forward to working with the committee in a bipartisan way to continue advancing HAB research so we can help communities prepare and prevent adverse environmental, economic, and health effects associated with the HABs. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move to any further. Mr. Walsh.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, offered by Mr. Waltz of Florida.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading and without objection. Mr. Walsh is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank my colleagues, Congressman Mast and Senator Rubio, for drafting this important bill, the South Florida Clean Coastal Waters Act of 2019, to address the harmful algal blooms and to improve water quality in our state. I also want to give credit to Governor DeSantis for prioritizing clean water and to Congressman Posey for co-sponsoring this manager's amendment. As the chairwoman described, red tides and blue-green algae have plagued Florida in recent years, impacting Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades, and both the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. This bill ensures that the task force, the interagency task force on harmful algal blooms, will produce an integrated assessment on the causes, consequences, potential mitigation options to reduce the blooms. It will identify current gaps in research and produce an action plan. The focus of the task force is the Everglades, and the health of the Everglades obviously impacts water quality of the entire state. And I think the key point here is that this is a statewide issue. For example, Lake Okeechobee feeds into the Indian River Lagoon on the Atlantic coast. The Indian River Lagoon stretches as far north as my district in northeast Florida, just south of Daytona. And as a result, the water quality of discharges from Lake Okeechobee have a direct impact on much of the Atlantic coast. So the manager's amendment takes that into account and clarifies that adjacent bodies of water, like the Indian River Lagoon estuary and others, are eligible for the assessment and action plan required by the underlying bill. My hope is that these best practices will improve water quality management and prevent HABs across the state. In my district, we have already seen blue-green algae in the St. Johns River this year, so that means it's spreading north and spreading across the state, and protecting the Blue Springs in Volusia County in my district is an ongoing effort. So this bill should provide a coherent strategy for Florida to improve water quality. Moving forward, the Congress should examine the Clean Water State Revolving Fund formula, especially if there is an effort to reauthorize the program. Currently, Florida has the third lowest allocation to population ratio. Given the water infrastructure needs of the state, frankly, that's unacceptable. I want to thank the chairwoman, the ranking member, Representative Mast, Representative Posey, for working with me on this amendment and ensuring that we can move this important legislation through the committee. I urge support for the amendment and passage of the underlying bill. Madam Chairwoman, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walsh. I'll offer a few quick comments on the amendment. The amendment offered by Mr. Walsh makes some improvements to the bill that take into account technical assistance of NOAA. The amendment also changes the definition of South Florida to ensure the assessment and action plan address the harmful red and brown tides of the west and east coast of Florida. I appreciate that minority staff that worked with us to make this happen, and I support the amendment. Any further discussion? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The amendment's adopted. Now, are there more amendments? If not, then a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 335 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table, and I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. And members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit the supplementary minority or additional views on this measure. Now, we're at a point where we will ask for a 10-minute break, a recess, and we'll come back and vote the postponed votes. And I would ask all members to please return for the markup. Thank you. The committee will come to order. We have, we will start with the Norman Amendment on, the bill is H.R. 3597, and does everybody remember what the Norman Amendment was? If not, vote anyway. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
No.
Chairwoman Johnson, no. Ms. Lofgren? No. Ms. Lofgren, no. Mr. Lipinski? No. Mr. Lipinski, no. Ms. Bonamici? No. Ms. Bonamici, no. Mr. Barra? No. Mr. Barra, no. Mr. Lamb? No. Mr. Lamb, no. Ms. Fletcher? No. Ms. Fletcher, no. Ms. Stevens? No. Ms. Stevens, no. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn, no. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill, no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Byer? No. Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Caston? No. Mr. Caston, no. Ms. Hill? No. Ms. Hill, no. Mr. McAdams? No. Mr. McAdams, no. Ms. Wexton? No. Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Lucas?
Aye.
Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Brooks? Aye. Mr. Brooks, aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Weber?
Yes.
Mr. Weber, aye. Mr. Babin?
Aye.
Mr. Babin, aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Marshall? Mr. Norman? Mr. Cloud?
Aye.
Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson, aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz, aye. Mr. Baird?
Aye.
Mr. Baird, aye. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler, aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon?
Are there members who haven't voted or would like to change their vote? The clerk will report.
Chairwoman Johnson, the noes are 21 and the ayes are 12.
The amendment is not adopted. Now, a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 3597 as amended to the House with the recommendation the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably
Madam Chair,
reported.
I request a recorded vote.
A requested vote is recognized. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
Aye.
Chairwoman Johnson, aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Yes.
Ms. Lofgren, aye. Mr. Lipinski? Aye. Mr. Lipinski, aye. Ms. Bonamici? Aye. Ms. Bonamici, aye. Mr. Barra? Aye. Mr. Barra, aye. Mr. Lamb? Mr. Lamb, aye. Ms. Fletcher? Ms. Fletcher, aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens, aye. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn, aye. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill, aye. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, aye. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer, aye. Mr. Chris? Mr. Chris, aye. Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston, aye. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill, aye. Mr. McAdams? Mr. McAdams, aye. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, aye. Mr. Lucas?
No.
Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks, no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Weber?
No.
Mr. Weber, no. Mr. Babin?
No.
Mr. Babin, no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Marshall? Mr. Norman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud, no. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson, no. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz, no. Mr. Baird?
No.
Mr. Baird, no. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler, no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Gonzalez Colon, no.
Have all members voted? Anyone wishing to change your vote? Clerk will report.
Chairwoman Johnson, the ayes are 21 and the noes are 13.
Thank you very much. The ayes have it, and it's a reporting quorum. Being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology move the bill with the recommendation it be approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplementary minority or additional views on this measure. Our next vote will occur on the Weber Amendment, number 1. From, on H.R. 3607. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
No.
Chairwoman Johnson, no. Ms. Lofgren? No. Ms. Lofgren, no. Mr. Lipinski? No. Mr. Lipinski, no. Ms. Bonamici? No. Ms. Bonamici, no. Mr. Barra? No. Mr. Barra, no. Mr. Lamb? No. Mr. Lamb, no. Ms. Fletcher? No. Ms. Fletcher, no. Ms. Stevens? No. Ms. Stevens, no. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn, no. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill, no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Chris? Mr. Chris, no. Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston, no. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill, no. Mr. McAdams? Mr. McAdams, no. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Lucas?
Yes.
Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks, aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber, aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin, aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Marshall? Mr. Norman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson, aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz, aye. Mr. Baird? Mr. Baird, aye. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler, aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Gonzalez Colon, aye.
Are there any members present who have not voted or would like to change their vote? The clerk will report.
Chairwoman, the noes are 21 and the ayes are 13.
The amendment is not adopted. We have a second amendment on H.R. 3607. That's Mr. Perlmutter's amendment. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
No.
Chairwoman Johnson, no. Ms. Lofgren? No. Ms. Lofgren, no. Mr. Lipinski? No. Mr. Lipinski, no. Ms. Bonamici? No. Ms. Bonamici, no. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra, no. Mr. Lamb? Mr. Lamb, no. Ms. Fletcher? No. Ms. Fletcher, no. Ms. Stevens? No. Ms. Stevens, no. Ms. Horn? No. Ms. Horn, no. Ms. Sherrill? No. Ms. Sherrill, no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston, no. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill, no. Mr. McAdams? Mr. McAdams, no. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas?
No.
Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Brooks? No. Mr. Brooks, no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Weber? No. Mr. Weber, no. Mr. Babin? No. Mr. Babin, no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Marshall? Mr. Norman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud, no. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson, no. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz, no. Mr. Baird? Mr. Baird, no. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler, no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Gonzalez Colon, no.
Are there any members who have not voted or would like to change their vote? Mr. Sherman? Anyway. Clerk will report. This was.
Chairwoman, the ayes are 4 and the noes are 30.
The amendment is not adopted. The vote now will occur on the bill. Oh, it's another amendment. Oh, the underlined Weber amendment. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
No.
Chairwoman Johnson, no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren, no. Mr. Lipinski? No. Mr. Lipinski, no. Ms. Bonamici? No. Ms. Bonamici, no. Mr. Barra? No. Mr. Barra, no. Mr. Lamb? No. Mr. Lamb, no. Ms. Fletcher? Aye. Ms. Fletcher, aye. Ms. Stevens? No. Ms. Stevens, no. Ms. Horn? Aye. Ms. Horn, aye. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill, no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Cohen?
We'll go to the full amendment, a full vote after.
Mr. Cohen, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston, no. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill, no. Mr. McAdams? Mr. McAdams, aye. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Lucas?
Aye.
Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Brooks?
Aye.
Mr. Brooks, aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Weber? Aye. Mr. Weber, aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin, aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Marshall? Mr. Norman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson, aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz, aye. Mr. Baird? Mr. Baird, aye. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler, aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Gonzalez Colon, aye.
Are there members who have not voted or wish to change your vote? Clerk will report.
Chairwoman, the ayes are 16 and the noes are 19.
The amendment is not adopted. A reporting quorum being present, I move the Committee of Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 3607 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will vote aye, and those opposed will vote no. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
Aye.
Chairwoman Johnson, aye. Ms. Lofgren? Aye. Ms. Lofgren, aye. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski, aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici, aye. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra, aye. Mr. Lamb? Aye. Mr. Lamb, aye. Ms. Fletcher? Aye. Ms. Fletcher, aye. Ms. Stevens? Aye. Ms. Stevens, aye. Ms. Horn? Aye. Ms. Horn, aye. Ms. Sherrill? Aye. Ms. Sherrill, aye. Mr. Sherman? Aye. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen, aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, aye. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer, aye. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston, aye. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill, aye. Mr. McAdams? Mr. McAdams, aye. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, aye. Mr. Lucas?
No.
Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks, no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber, no. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin, no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Marshall? Mr. Norman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud, no. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson, no. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz, no. Mr. Baird? Mr. Baird, no. Ms. Herrera Butler? Ms. Herrera Butler, no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Gonzalez Colon, no.
Have all members voted? Any members wishing to change their vote? Clerk will report.
Chairwoman, the ayes are 22 and the noes are 13.
The bill is reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on this measure. Is that
Next vote, the Weber amendment, H.R. 3609.
the bill is passed. The next question is on the Weber amendment for 3609. What did we just vote?
That's correct.
Oh, that's the second one, okay.
Clerk will call the roll.
Clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
You're no. Say no. Ms. Johnson, say no.
No.
Chairwoman Johnson, no. Ms. Lofgren? No. Ms. Lofgren, no. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski, no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici, no. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra, no. Mr. Lamb? Mr. Lamb, no. Ms. Fletcher? Ms. Fletcher, no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens, no. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn, no. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill, no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston, no. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill, no. Mr. McAdams? Mr. McAdams, no. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks, aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber, aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin, aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Marshall? Mr. Norman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson, aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz, aye. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird, aye. Ms. Herrera Butler. Ms. Herrera Butler, aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, aye.
Are there members who have not voted or would like to change their vote? Clerk will report.
Chairwoman, the ayes are 13 and the noes are 21.
What was it? The amendment is not adopted. Are there, let's see, if not, the reporting quorum is present. I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 3609 as amendment to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying ayes, and those opposed, no. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson.
Aye.
Chairwoman Johnson, aye. Ms. Lofgren. Aye. Ms. Lofgren, aye. Mr. Lipinski. Aye. Mr. Lipinski, aye. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici, aye. Mr. Barra. Mr. Barra, aye. Mr. Lamb. Aye. Mr. Lamb, aye. Ms. Fletcher. Aye. Ms. Fletcher, aye. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens, aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn, aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston, aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill, aye. Mr. McAdams. Mr. McAdams, aye. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, aye. Mr. Lucas.
No.
Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks, no. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber, no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin, no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Norman. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, no. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson, no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz, no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird, no. Ms. Herrera Butler. Ms. Herrera Butler, no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, no.
Have all members voted? Any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will report.
Chairwoman, the ayes are 21 and the noes are 13.
The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table, and I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplementary minority or additional views on this measure. I want to thank the members for their attendance and participation, and hopefully we can continue to work toward getting these bills to the floor and getting them passed. Our markup is concluded.